Hello, welcome to another book report. Have a pretty interesting book here. We Are Bellingcat, Global Crime, Online Sleuths, and the Bold Future of News by Eliot Higgins, who was a founder and I think now president, or I don't know his position within Bellingcat. Anyway, the Bellingcat team was one of the first to really, in a meticulous fashion, formalize rules and procedures and connections with news and police organizations, connecting online sleuthing, online basically being detectives using online sources of information only, or primarily, and actually proving things through online sources, making connections, building narratives, and building a body of evidence to determine what's a fact, and what's unproven. And so basically it's open source, internet based fact gathering. And they've been around for a little while now, and it's just I think an important part of the future of particularly pushing back against what he calls the counterfactual community. I like that phrase, counterfactual community. So I think it already is an important piece of fighting for human rights and news sources and verifying what's really happening in the world, and fighting against fake news, real fake news. It's just pathetic that we have more documentary evidence, more people traveling around the world. It's easier than ever to get a realistic perception of what's actually happening in the world, and yet this conspiracy theory, which I hate that term actually, but like these disinformation bubbles, the counterfactual community, I like that phrase. The counterfactual community seems to be bigger than ever, at least in the more wealthy countries. Very ironic. Anyway, back to the book. We Are Bellingcat. Very interesting read for anyone interested in online sleuthing, online fact checking. I have to admit I did skim significant portions of it because he really goes into details on how certain bodies of evidence were put together and presented to news media in the world, and how all the connections were made and how it was all done in a very detailed fashion, which just that wasn't the most compelling parts to me. I mean, of course, it's an area I'm familiar with, so maybe that's why. Anyway, but I did really enjoy other pieces of the book, and I did read the whole thing. I just, like I said, certain pieces I skimmed and didn't read as carefully as I usually do. So anyway, let's see, the first 79. Oh yeah. I liked this description of it. I mean, I've been aware of this kind of thing for over a decade now, but I never thought of it as the scientific method applied to journalism, is to quote the book here. And his example is, they took, in one case, they took some person's work. This was during the first Ukraine war when Russia invaded the eastern provinces of Ukraine, and took over the Crimea, I believe, as well too. I forget the exact timeline on that. Anyway, they took They went down one line of evidence, starting with a very pro-Kiev site that was definitely not impartial. Anyway, that murkiness would have frightened away a traditional journalist, but the Bellingcat method is independent verification. We do not need to know about Chris Postal, the person who put this evidence on the or hypothesis with supporting evidence onto a very pro-Ukrainian website. Only whether we could replicate the research. I love that. It's like you're getting hypotheses from a source is fine, because either you can recreate the evidence or you can't. And if you can't recreate the evidence, then it's junk. But if you can recreate it, then you might be onto something. Anyway, we did not need to know about the person providing this hypothesis with evidence, only that we could replicate the research. To us, an online claim is nothing more than a hypothesis, one validated only with backing evidence that others should be able to corroborate themselves. It's akin to the scientific method applied to journalism. Anyway, yeah, I think that's one of the most valuable pieces of this book. I mean, if you're completely unfamiliar with Bellingcat and open source research and fact-finding, and it's something you're interested in, this is a must-read. But even if you're familiar with Bellingcat and what they do and what people like them do, it's still worth reading, because it really puts down a lot of the rules and ideas and core concepts in a really clear way. And I really like that. The scientific method applied to journalism. Brilliant. All right, 120, last full paragraph. Oh, yeah. And then here he's kind of describing, in this section, he's describing the counterfactual community. So, anti-vaxxers, 9/11 truthers, climate change denial, anti-Semitic stuff. Anyway, the main reason I bring this up is that I liked his analysis in that it was much less about left-right and more about anti-globalist, anti-U.S. government, those kinds of dividing lines, right? Because you have a lot of the same information winding up on extreme left-wing and extreme right-wing sources of information, where the common the unifying factor being anti-U.S. or anti something, right? So it's not so much left-right; it's more I don't know. I guess anti-government, I'm not actually quite sure the best language on that, but anyway, I appreciated that it wasn't so much left-right for the counterfactual communities. Although I think the right is in the U.S. is way more into it at the moment. Anyway, 146. Oh, yeah, I liked what he talked about a mass shooting here. So he talked about 8chan, which is basically like a chat community where there's no editing at all, and some pretty extreme content gets put up and stays up, including incitement to violence. I mean, it's pretty bad. Anyway, an element of neo-fascist terrorism that 8chan stirred is what Robert called, quote, the gamification, close quote, of mass violence. While billions of people have played video games and almost none are moved to harm others, elements of gaming culture have become incorporated into attacks. Live streaming on a helmet cam showed the Christchurch gunman's perspective with a weapon in hand, eerily like the view in a shoot-'em-up video games or single-person shooter games, where you have the perspective of the shooter. Anyway, several mass shootings, and they put music to it too. So the gamification of mass shootings. which ties right in with the slow motion riot theory as well. That uh, that people that are attracted to this type of suicide or this type of insanity feed off of the previous mass shooters in a really significant way, and gamification is an example of that. But that they definitely mimic their quote unquote heroes who did mass shootings before them, and feed off of that, and it's like a slow motion riot. So things that they wouldn't have even dreamed of doing become normalized, and like, well, of course I'm going to have a little camera on my helmet, and I'll broadcast, I'll live cast the whole thing. And 30 years, 20 years ago, even though it was technically possible, nobody would have thought of doing that. Anyway, let's see. Oh, read it all. Okay, yeah, first full paragraph, 152. Okay, so, and then this is getting back to the pushing back against the counterfactual community. And still, fact-checking projects are minuscule compared with the reach of disinformation. An intriguing essay published by the British fact-checking organization Full Fact contended that a first generation of online fact-checkers followed a, quote, publish and pray, close quote, approach that still applies too widely. A second iteration sought to affect public debate more directly, confronting the sources of fakery, demanding corrections in print, complaining to standards bodies while pressuring institutions to take action. A third iteration of fact-checkers, Full Fact argued, must meet the scale of the internet, probably through massive collaborations that disregard national frontiers. We are pushing for exactly that, we being Bellingcat. So yeah, the fact-checking community or elements like that are pushing back against the disinformation spheres in the world today, or the counterfactual community, really need to scale up. And I completely agree. And I like that. And I'm very happy that Bellingcat and other groups are working on that. I see social media actually as part of the solution here. I mean, obviously, they're a big part of the problem. But social networking, particularly like an open source kind of social networking with trust scores, open source trust scores, and allowing people to, for themselves, follow the work of fact checkers and people like Bellingcat, and prove for themselves. That's the beauty of this. It's all open source. It's all scientific in the sense that you can reproduce it yourself, and but in a real way, not the fake way that a lot of the fantasy counterfactual community likes to build up, right? So a well-constructed social network will easily penetrate these little echo boxes and say, oh, well, no, that's all video from 20 years ago, 10 years ago, that has nothing to do with what they claim it is. And here's the evidence, and here's 10 examples showing, proving that is true, and so piercing those bubbles in a way that people can prove for themselves, and doing it in a socially connected way to pierce those little echo chambers that currently exist, hopefully. All right. Oh, yeah. This was interesting. I'd never really heard or thought of this before. A lot of the people doing this work are seeing truly horrific video. Even though they're not physically in a war zone, they're effectively spending a lot of virtual time in war zones, and it's causing PTSD. He sought help and was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, the condition long associated with soldiers haunted by horrors on the battlefield. Psychologists have come to identify another variety of PTSD, vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. So basically, your nervous system can react to large amounts of extreme violence in videos in a similar way to actually being there. very interesting and not something I'd ever really thought of before for the people doing this kind of Bellingcat work and are seeing a lot of these horrors repeatedly. And it's great, you know. I mean, they're very on top of it, and like, you know, how do you de-stress? How do you prevent these secondary traumas, or at least try to minimize their impact and protect yourself and all that. So, and my last note: must preserve open source criminal evidence. Definitely. Yeah. This I really appreciated. I mean, I knew that Bellingcat had been working with human rights organizations and other, the World Criminal Court and other law enforcement agencies, but in terms of long term, I really appreciated this. So someday open source evidence like this may appear in court, but this raises a question. If you are a prosecutor in 2035 considering Syrian war crime allegations from 2020, where would you look? You might scour YouTube or its future equivalents, but will everything that was once posted still be available? Will it have been verified? Will the clips be findable? I think about those who saved the diaries of Second World War survivors. Today, equally valuable documentation exists in video form. We have a duty to preserve it. So a big part, and I know they're doing that for the current Ukraine war as well, probably the most, after the Syrian war conflict was probably the most documented conflict in all of history. And I know Bellingcat had a project to do chain of custody and document Syria and stuff. And there's another project to do the same thing with the Ukraine war, which is now the most documented war ever. So the crimes on both sides, predominantly on the Russian side, no question, are being very well documented. Not all of them, but as many as we can. And hopefully down the road, some of those criminals will be held accountable. Starting with Putin, of course. Anyway, I really like that it's really important to establish chain of custody and authenticity of these sources for future justice. That could be decades down the road, perhaps, right? Anyway, so if you're interested in open source online sleuthing, very good read from one of the people who helped create, that helped develop and create the standards that have made it so successful. Okay, until the next book report, happy reading.